Hello, dear friends. Please join me and listen to this story. My brother-in-law threw a glass of wine on me, then sneered. If you're so tough, fight me. Let the whole family see how good you really are. Everyone waited for me to lose my temper, but I quietly took off my earrings, set them on the table, pulled my hair back, and walked straight into the ring. Exactly 50 seconds later, my brother-in-law was sprawled on the floor. I rolled up my sleeve, revealing the scars from combat, and said, "You want to know what it's like to go up against a special reconnaissance soldier?" 4 days before Derek ended up sprawled on the floor of that ring, I drove into Colorado Springs thinking this trip home would be nothing more than an ordinary family visit. I was wrong. My name is Jessica Parker. I'm 38 years old. I've spent most of my adult life in the military, used to mornings that begin before sunrise, deployments without knowing exactly when I'll be home, and situations where a single wrong decision can change everything. But this time, I wasn't coming home for a mission. I was coming back for the high school graduation of Ethan, the only son of my younger sister, Rachel. I had promised Ethan that no matter what happened, I would be there. It was a small promise, but to me, it meant more than he knew. Over the previous 16 years, I had missed too much of my family's life. Birthdays, Thanksgivings, Christmases, Ethan's ball games. Some years, I saw him only through a phone screen, and every time I called home, I noticed he was a little taller, his voice a little deeper, until one day I realized that the little boy who used to ask me whether soldiers were afraid of the dark was almost a man. Around 5 that afternoon, the mountains west of Colorado Springs came into view through my windshield. Thin streaks of snow still clung to the higher peaks even though the city below had already warmed up. I lowered the window a little and let the cool, dry air flow into the car. Some places don't need a sign to tell you you're home. Colorado Springs was like that for me. 16 years earlier, I had left this place with a few bags and a younger sister who was so angry she could barely look at me. Back then, Rachel thought I was abandoning the family. I thought I was simply choosing the life I wanted to live. Years later, I understood that some things aren't as simple as who was right and who was wrong. I turned into the neighborhood where Rachel lived. The lawns were neatly trimmed, cars were parked in orderly rows in front of 2-story houses, and American flags hung from several porches. An older man was pulling a trash can into his garage. 2 children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Everything looked so peaceful that I told myself I had worried for nothing. It was just a graduation, a dinner, a few days with family. I had handled far more complicated situations than this. Then I saw the black Corvette parked in front of Rachel's house. I knew Derek was home. The car was polished enough to reflect the trees along the street. It sat slightly across the center of the driveway, taking up more room than necessary. I almost laughed. That was very Derek. I had barely shut off the engine when the front door opened. Ethan ran down the steps before I could even get my luggage. It took me a second to recognize him. He was much taller than the last time I'd seen him, his shoulders broader, his hair cut short, the childishness gone from his face. But when he smiled, I could still see the little boy who used to stay up late waiting for me to call home just so he could ask silly questions about the military. Ethan hugged me so tightly that I had to step back half a step. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. There are moments that make you realize just how much time has taken from you without your even noticing. When Ethan grabbed my bag, I didn't fight him for it. I looked up at the porch. Rachel was standing there. My younger sister looked almost the way I remembered her. Her brown hair was longer, and her face still had the features that made strangers say we looked alike. But I had known Rachel long enough to notice something else. She wasn't truly happy to see me. Rachel came down and hugged me. The hug lasted just long enough that no one could have called it cold. Then she stepped back and looked me over from head to toe. The look lasted only a moment, but I caught it. I had spent years being trained to notice small details. A door opening when it normally didn't. A room suddenly going quiet. Someone who usually talked a lot, suddenly saying nothing. Families were no different. The only difference was that sometimes you tried to convince yourself you were imagining it. I followed Rachel inside. Derek was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine in his hand. He stood when he saw me. Derek was in his 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with neatly cut hair and the build of someone who still worked out regularly. He had trained in mixed martial arts for more than 10 years and very much enjoyed making sure other people knew it. We exchanged a brief greeting. Then, less than a minute later, Derek brought up the Corvette outside. I wasn't surprised. Derek had always liked things that could be measured by price. Cars. houses, sales figures, watches, numbers in a bank account. That didn't mean he was lazy. Quite the opposite. Derek worked very hard. He owned a high-end car dealership in Colorado Springs, and from what Rachel had told me, he had built it from a small operation into a fairly successful business. Derek was always quick to remind people that no one had ever handed him anything. He had started with nothing. He had earned every dollar himself. He had built everything himself. I had heard that story many times during family phone calls. That night, I got to hear almost the entire thing again. Dinner was fairly elaborate. Rachel made the steak Ethan liked, baked potatoes, and a salad she knew I usually ate. If you looked only at the dinner table, you might have thought we were a very close family. But families that are truly close don't have to work so hard to look that way. Derek did most of the talking. He talked about the dealership, a deal he had just closed, a new car that had just come in, and how this year's sales might beat last year's. He talked about how he had once had to borrow money, how people had looked down on him, how he had worked 14-hour days. I listened. Every now and then, I nodded. Rachel smiled at the parts she seemed to have heard dozens of times before. Ethan barely spoke at all. That was the first thing that truly got my attention. The boy I knew had never been able to stay quiet that long, especially with me home after years apart. On the phone, Ethan always had dozens of things he wanted to tell me about. School, friends, sports, the books he was reading. But that night, he just ate. Every time Derek mentioned the future, Ethan lowered his eyes to his plate. I didn't ask. It wasn't time yet. In the military, you learn that sometimes the quickest way to make someone hide something from you is to ask about it too soon. So I just watched. Derek talked about how, after graduation, Ethan could finally start learning what real life was like. He said 18 was the age when a young man needed to stop dreaming and learn how to make money. Rachel didn't disagree. Ethan remained silent. I began to understand that the tension I was feeling hadn't started with my arrival. It had already been living in that house. I had simply walked into the middle of it. After the main course, Rachel brought out dessert. The conversation shifted to me. She asked how long I planned to stay. I said I would leave after the graduation because I had work to get back to. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then I saw a familiar expression on my sister's face. It was the look she always had before saying something she had been holding inside for too long. Rachel began bringing up all the times I had been gone. She didn't yell. That somehow made the words heavier. She mentioned the birthdays I had missed. The holidays I couldn't come home for. Ethan's ball games that I had seen only in photographs. I didn't argue. Because it was true. I could have explained where I had been on every one of those days. I could have told her about deployments, orders, and plans that changed at the last minute. But explanations couldn't give those lost days back. Rachel looked at me for a long time before saying the words that silenced the entire table. You know how to fight, Jessica. But do you know how to build a family? I didn't answer right away. Not because I was angry, because the question hit a place I didn't want to admit still hurt. I looked at Ethan. He immediately looked down. Derek leaned back in his chair and slowly turned the wine glass in his hand. He looked more comfortable than he should have, like a man who had been waiting for the conversation to reach this point. That was when I understood Derek wasn't going to let it stop there. He started talking about the difference between the military and normal life. Responsibility, money, family, the things he believed someone like me didn't truly understand because I had spent most of my life simply following orders and collecting a steady paycheck. I still said nothing. Silence often makes people who need to prove they're right talk even more. Derek was no different. Finally, he looked straight at me and said something I still remember clearly. In the real world, medals don't pay the bills. The room went silent. Ethan immediately looked up. Rachel looked at Derek, but she didn't stop him. I looked at the glass in his hand, then back at the confident face across from me. I had met many kinds of people in my life. Some people speak loudly because they are strong. Others speak loudly because they need everyone else to believe they are strong. Derek was the second kind. I didn't argue. I simply told him he was right. Medals didn't pay the bills, which was why I had never tried to use them to pay mine. Ethan lowered his head to hide a smile. Derek stopped smiling. Only for a few seconds. Then he raised his glass again as though what had just happened wasn't worth mentioning. But I had seen it. A tiny flash of irritation, not because I had insulted him, because I hadn't reacted the way he expected me to. After dinner, I carried the plates into the kitchen. Through the glass door at the back of the house, I could see the reflections of the three people still sitting at the table. Derek was talking. Rachel was silent. Ethan was looking down. I stood there a little longer. There was a time when I thought the most important skill the military had taught me was how to face danger. Later, I realized that wasn't it. The most important skill was recognizing that something was wrong before you knew exactly what it was. That night, I didn't yet know what Ethan was hiding from me. I didn't know how deeply Rachel resented me, and I certainly didn't know that Derek had decided his son's future long ago. I knew only one thing. I had come back to Colorado Springs for a graduation, but during that very first dinner, I began to feel as though I had stepped into the middle of a battle that had been going on long before I arrived. That night, I didn't ask Ethan anything else. I had learned long ago that when a young person is trying to hide something, forcing them to talk only makes them shut down faster. If they truly want you to know, sooner or later they'll find a way to get you alone. Ethan did exactly that the next morning. Out of habit, I woke up before 6. The house was still quiet. I made coffee, carried my cup onto the back porch, and sat watching the first light of day slowly move across the distant rooftops. About 20 minutes later, the back door opened. Ethan came outside. He was wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and he looked as though he had been awake for a long time. He didn't sit down. He just stood there for a few seconds, then asked if I could come out to the garage with him. I set down my coffee. I knew immediately this wasn't about a car. Rachel's garage was large enough for 3 vehicles, but that morning it held only Derek's pickup truck and the old car Ethan still drove to school. Light came through the small windows in the garage door, cutting thin strips across the concrete floor. Ethan closed the door, connecting the garage to the house behind us. That caught my attention. He didn't want his parents to hear. I didn't ask why. I just leaned against the workbench near the wall and waited. Ethan walked over to his car, opened the passenger door, and pulled out a stack of papers folded in half. He held them for a long moment, as though he still wasn't sure whether he should give them to me. Finally, he handed them over. On top was a printed email. I read it slowly. It was from a university I knew Ethan had mentioned several times during our previous phone calls. I had assumed he was interested because the school had a pretty good engineering program. I was wrong. Ethan had applied to the university's Reserve Officers Training Corps program and for the scholarship that came with it. I looked up at him. For the first time since I had returned, Ethan looked genuinely nervous. He told me he had been working on the application for almost a year. Grades, extracurricular activities, letters of recommendation, physical fitness tests. He had even met with an admissions representative and spoken with an officer in charge of the program. I turned to the next page. There were copies of emails, appointment schedules, and a list of everything Ethan had completed. He hadn't done this on impulse. The more I read, the more I understood that this wasn't an idea he had picked up from a few war movies or a few stories I had told him. Ethan had been thinking about this for a long time. I asked why he had never told me. He lowered his eyes. The answer was simple. He was afraid I would tell Rachel. I didn't know whether that made me sad or made me understand him better. Ethan said that at first, he had only wanted to try. If he didn't qualify, he would accept it. If he changed his mind, he would withdraw on his own. But at the very least, he wanted that decision to be his. About 6 weeks earlier, he had been notified that his application had passed the initial review. The program representative had even sent him an email asking him to complete several additional steps to move on to the next stage. Then, 3 weeks later, everything suddenly stopped. Ethan handed me the final page. I read it twice. The notice didn't say his application had been rejected. It didn't say his grades weren't good enough. It didn't say the scholarship had been awarded to someone else. There was only one sentence that made me stop. His application had been withdrawn from consideration. By request. I looked at Ethan. He shook his head before I could even ask. He had never made that request. I looked back at the paper. My years in the military had given me a habit that sometimes annoyed people. When something didn't add up, I didn't like guessing. I wanted to know exactly what I was looking at. I asked Ethan if he might have accidentally clicked something. No. Did anyone else know the password to his account? Ethan went quiet. Only for a second. But I noticed. He said Rachel had helped him complete some of his college applications before, so she might know the password. Derek had also sat down with him to look over financial information and tuition costs. I said nothing. There was no evidence that either of his parents had done it, And I wasn't going to turn suspicion into fact simply because it was convenient. I handed the papers back. Ethan was still standing in front of me. He didn't ask me what he should do. He asked something else. Did I think he was capable of doing it? I looked at him longer than usual. Maybe that was the real reason he had brought me out to the garage. Not to ask me to fix his application. Not to ask me to confront his parents. He wanted to know whether someone he trusted thought his dream was ridiculous. I told Ethan that whether he was capable wasn't something I could decide after one morning in a garage. The program would evaluate him. The university would evaluate him. He would have to evaluate himself, too. But if he was asking whether he deserved the right to try, then the answer was yes. Ethan looked down at the papers. His shoulders seemed to relax a little. At that moment, the door connecting the garage to the house opened. Derek was standing there. He was already dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt, holding his car keys in one hand. I had no idea how long he had been standing behind that door. His eyes moved from Ethan to the papers, then settled on me. No one said anything for a few seconds. Then Derek told Ethan to get ready, because he wanted to take his son to the dealership. It wasn't a question. It was an announcement. About an hour later, I understood why. Rachel had an appointment to take care of a few things for the graduation, so I went with Derek and Ethan to the dealership. I hadn't planned to go, but Derek invited me himself. Maybe after the conversation in the garage, he wanted to show me something he believed I didn't understand. The dealership sat along one of the main roads in Colorado Springs. I had to admit, it was impressive. Tall glass windows, gleaming floors, expensive cars lined up beneath bright white lights. Employees greeted Derek constantly as he walked by. He remembered their names, remembered the deals that were pending, and even remembered a customer who was coming in that afternoon for a test drive. It was the first time I had seen Derek in an environment where he was genuinely good at what he did. He wasn't just bragging, he had built something substantial, and maybe that was exactly why he believed even more strongly that his path was the only sensible one. Derek led us through the showroom, up to the second floor, and stopped in front of a small office with a glass door. Inside was a new desk, a new computer, a leather chair. There was even an unopened box of office supplies sitting on the desk. I assumed it was an office for a new employee. Then I saw the nameplate. Ethan Parker. I turned to Ethan. He didn't look surprised. He just looked tired. Derek had prepared the office weeks earlier. His plan was perfectly clear. After graduation, Ethan would start working at the dealership on Monday. First, he would learn the sales process, then move into finance, vehicle inventory management, and eventually learn how to run the business. Derek had planned several years into the future. He described it with the confidence of someone explaining a schedule the entire family had already agreed to. But I looked at Ethan. I saw no agreement on his face. I asked Derek whether Ethan had said yes. The atmosphere shifted ever so slightly. Derek replied that sometimes 18-year-olds didn't know what was best for them. I didn't argue. I just looked back at the nameplate. Ethan's name had been placed on the door of an office before he had even been allowed to decide whether he wanted to walk through it. By that afternoon, when we returned home, the tension was no longer hidden as well as it had been the day before. Rachel was arranging things in the kitchen when Ethan went straight upstairs to his room. Derek followed a few minutes later and went to change clothes. That left Rachel and me alone. She set a tray down on the counter, harder than necessary. I knew the conversation was coming. Rachel asked what Ethan had told me in the garage. I didn't answer right away. She looked at me, and I realized she already knew. Maybe Derek had told her. Maybe Rachel already knew Ethan had hidden the application papers in his car. It didn't matter anymore. I simply said Ethan was worried about his college application. Rachel gave a humorless little laugh. She didn't ask how much I knew. Instead, she started talking about the military. About the years I had been away. About the times the whole family had no idea exactly where I was. About the short phone calls. About the time I came home with my arm covered in scars and refused to tell her what had happened. I stood still beside the kitchen counter. That was when I finally understood that Rachel's anger hadn't started with Ethan. It had started with me. She had never truly forgiven me for leaving Colorado Springs. And now, in her eyes, history was repeating itself with her son. Rachel believed Ethan wanted a military career because of me, because of the stories he had heard, because of the photographs, because of the medals he had seen, because, in the eyes of a child, all those years I had been gone had turned into something more beautiful than they really were. I told her I had never encouraged Ethan to join the military. Rachel didn't care. That was when her voice changed. It was no longer sarcastic the way it had been the night before. It became the voice of someone who had been afraid for far too long. You disappeared from this family for 16 years, Jessica. Don't come back now and take my son too. I didn't answer immediately. The words hurt more than I expected, not because they were fair, because I could hear the fear behind them. Rachel didn't think she was controlling Ethan, she thought she was protecting him. But there was one thing I had learned after many years. People can do the wrong things for reasons they truly believe are right. I looked toward the stairs. Upstairs, Ethan's bedroom door was shut, then I looked back at my sister. I still didn't know who had withdrawn Ethan's application. I didn't know how much Derek knew. I also didn't know how far Rachel had gone to keep her son from leaving. But by that afternoon, I was certain of one thing. The problem in that house was no longer simply an 18-year-old boy choosing a college. It was a struggle between the future Ethan wanted and the future his parents had already decided for him before he ever had a chance to speak for himself. By that evening, I no longer believed Ethan's withdrawn application was simply an administrative mistake. But suspicion wasn't evidence. I had lived long enough with the consequences of people reaching conclusions too quickly to make that same mistake myself. So the next morning, I didn't ask Rachel anything more. I didn't bring it up with Derek either. I simply suggested that Ethan contact the person in charge of the program at the university directly. He had already sent 2 emails but hadn't received a reply. I told him to call. Ethan hesitated. He said he didn't know how to begin. I told him to simply tell the truth. No long explanations, no accusations, just ask where his application had stopped and why. The first call didn't reach the right person. The second call was transferred through 3 departments. By nearly noon, Ethan finally managed to leave a message for an admissions representative he had spoken with several months earlier. Then we waited. Maybe that was the hardest part for Ethan. He paced around the house, checking his phone constantly, then putting it back down as if he were trying to convince himself he didn't care. I understood the feeling. Sometimes people say they just want to know the truth, but what they really fear most is the moment the truth answers back. Around 2 that afternoon, Ethan's phone rang. He was sitting at the kitchen table. I was across from him, pretending to read the news on my phone, though in reality, I had noticed the unfamiliar number the moment his screen lit up. Ethan answered. At first, he gave only short replies. Then his back straightened. I saw the expression on his face change before I heard what was being said. He asked the person to repeat it once, then a second time. The call lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, Ethan set his phone down very slowly. I didn't ask right away. He looked at me. Aunt Jessica. Those 2 words were enough. I put my own phone down. Ethan said the program representative had reviewed his entire application. He had never been rejected. In fact, his original application had been deemed eligible to move forward. Ethan had received an invitation to complete additional steps for the next stage. That matched the email I had seen in the garage. But 3 days after the invitation was sent, Ethan's account had been logged into, and an official request had been submitted to withdraw him from consideration. There had been no rejection from the university, no system error, no unfavorable decision from the review board. Someone had deliberately withdrawn the application, from Ethan's own account. I looked at him. His face had gone pale, not because he had lost the scholarship, but because, for the first time, he understood that this might not have been an accident. I asked if he was absolutely sure he had never logged in and clicked something by mistake. Ethan shook his head. I asked whether, during that period, he had ever told anyone he wanted to quit. No. Had he ever changed his mind? No. Had he ever asked his parents to handle the application for him? Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said Rachel had sat with him while he completed the financial paperwork. Derek had also asked to see the pages related to tuition costs. Both of them could have known the password. I didn't like where this was going, but I liked even less that Ethan had already started drawing his own conclusions. I told him he couldn't accuse anyone yet, not yet. The fact that the account had been used didn't mean we knew exactly who had logged in. Maybe the password had been saved on the family computer. Maybe another device was still logged into the account. Maybe there was an explanation we didn't know yet. I told Ethan all of that, but in my mind, I started putting the pieces together. Rachel was afraid of her son joining the military. Derek had already prepared a job for him at the dealership. An office already had Ethan's name on the door. A future had already been decided for him. And right in the middle of all of it, the one application that could have taken Ethan down a different path had been withdrawn. I didn't like coincidences. That afternoon, Derek came home early. He walked into the kitchen, still wearing the shirt he had worn at the dealership, his car keys and phone in his hands. Rachel was upstairs. Ethan had just stepped into the backyard. That was when I decided to ask. Not confront him, just ask. I briefly explained that the school representative had called back and confirmed that Ethan's application had not been rejected. His account had submitted a withdrawal request 3 days after he received the invitation to continue. Derek didn't look surprised at all. That caught my attention more than his answer did. He opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, twisted off the cap, and took a drink. Then he laughed. Kids change their minds every day. Don't turn this into a military operation. I looked at him. Derek looked back at me calmly. If he was lying, he was pretty good at it. I asked when Ethan had told him he had changed his mind. Derek's smile faded slightly. He said he didn't remember exactly. Then he added that maybe Ethan had panicked when he realized the program was more serious than he had expected. I didn't argue. I simply asked why Ethan didn't remember withdrawing his own application. Derek set the bottle down. This time, he didn't smile. He said I had only been back a few days and didn't understand his son. Ethan sometimes got excited about something and then dropped it quickly. Derek had raised him for 18 years, while I had mostly appeared through a few phone calls every month. He said it very calmly. But the purpose was obvious. He was reminding me of my place. I didn't react, partly because he was right. I hadn't raised Ethan. I hadn't been there for 18 years of his life. But I also knew what fear looked like on someone's face when they told you that an important decision had been taken out of their hands. And Ethan did not look like a kid who had forgotten that he had withdrawn his own application. That night, I lay awake for a long time. From the guest room, I heard doors opening and closing upstairs, footsteps in the hallway, then Derek and Rachel speaking quietly in their bedroom at the far end of the house. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't try to. But the next morning, everyone in the house became unusually polite. Rachel asked if I wanted coffee. Derek talked about the weather. Ethan said nothing. It was graduation day. By afternoon, the house was full of people. Grandparents, aunts and uncles, a few family friends, neighbors, and several of Derek's close employees from the dealership had all come over. Long tables had been set up in the backyard. Food covered the kitchen counters. And photographs of Ethan from kindergarten through his senior year of high school were lined up across the living room table. From the outside, it looked like a perfect day. Ethan wore his graduation gown, posed for pictures with everyone, and smiled whenever someone pointed a phone at him, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He still hadn't told his parents that the school representative had confirmed what happened with his withdrawn application. I hadn't told Rachel, either. I thought Ethan should decide for himself when he wanted to say it. I didn't know Derek had already prepared another decision for him. After everyone had nearly finished eating, Derek stood up in the middle of the living room and called Ethan over. The atmosphere changed immediately. Derek liked moments like this. There was an audience, there was attention, there was something he knew would impress everyone. He said a few words about how proud he was that his son had graduated, and about how a man needed to begin building his life through real work. Then he pulled a small black box from his pocket. Inside was a car key. One relative whistled. Derek pointed toward the front of the house. Out on the street, parked just behind his Corvette, was a dark blue Mustang with a large ribbon tied across the hood. Everyone immediately applauded. Someone said Ethan was lucky. Someone else laughed and said that if they had gotten a car like that at 18, they wouldn't have slept for a week. Ethan didn't smile. Derek placed the key in his son's hand. Then, in front of the entire family, he announced that Ethan would start working at the dealership Monday morning. Not as a trial, not just for a few months over the summer. He said it as though the future had already been decided. Ethan would learn sales, then finance, then management. One day, the dealership would be his. Everyone applauded again. Rachel stood beside Derek, her eyes red with emotion. I looked at Ethan. He stared at the key in his palm. No one noticed his silence because the room was too loud, but I did. Derek patted his son on the shoulder, and that was when Ethan did something he probably didn't even know he had the courage to do. He walked over to the nearby table. He set the key down. The sound of metal touching wood wasn't loud, but everyone in the room heard it. The conversation slowly stopped. Derek looked at the key, then at Ethan. Ethan spoke very briefly. He thanked his father, but he didn't want the car, and he wasn't going to the dealership on Monday. The room became so quiet I could hear the air conditioning unit running overhead. Rachel was the first one whose expression changed. Derek stood completely still. A few relatives looked at one another, unsure whether they should pretend they hadn't heard or leave the room. Ethan continued, his voice firmer this time. He said he had other plans. Derek asked what plans. I knew the moment had finally arrived. Ethan said he still wanted to pursue the Reserve Officers Training Corps program at college. Derek's face changed. Not much, just enough for me to notice. He looked at me almost immediately. Not at his son. At me. That told me more than anything he had said before. Derek stepped around the table. He pointed straight at me. Before you showed up, he never dared talk to me like that. I didn't answer. Ethan immediately said this had nothing to do with me. Derek didn't listen. In his mind, the story already had a villain. Me. Rachel moved to stand beside her husband. I had hoped that, at the very least, she would look at her son before making up her mind. She didn't. Rachel said Ethan had changed the moment I came back. That I had made him think Derek's life wasn't good enough. That a few stories about the military had made him turn his back on the path his parents had spent years preparing for him. Ethan tried to speak. Rachel cut him off. Derek kept looking at me. And for the first time since returning to Colorado Springs, I understood that this had gone far beyond a college application. Derek didn't simply want Ethan to work for him. He needed Ethan to choose the life he had already built for him. Because if Ethan refused, Derek didn't see a son growing into an adult. He saw defiance. And if Ethan couldn't be blamed, Derek needed someone else to hold responsible. I was standing right in front of him. A very convenient choice. I looked at the Mustang key still lying in the middle of the table. The most expensive gift in the room. And also the one thing no one had ever asked Ethan if he actually wanted. At that moment, I didn't know Derek would drink more than usual that night. I also didn't know that a few hours later, in front of the whole family and the people at the Mixed Martial Arts Club, the anger he was trying to hold behind clenched teeth would find another target. But when I saw the way he looked at me in that room, I knew one thing. It should have ended with the Mustang key lying on the table. A few relatives began finding reasons to go outside. The others spoke more quietly, pretending nothing had happened. Rachel cleared away plates that were still almost full. Derek stood by the window with both hands on his hips, looking out at the street where the Mustang still had the blue ribbon tied across its hood. Ethan went upstairs. I thought the party was over. But Derek had reserved a private room at the Mixed Martial Arts Club where he trained, so they could continue celebrating after the graduation. Several of his friends were already waiting there. Cake, drinks, and some food had also been delivered ahead of time. Canceling now would mean having to explain. Derek wasn't the kind of man who liked other people knowing there had been trouble in his house. Around 8 that evening, he came downstairs wearing a different shirt, smiling as if the confrontation earlier had never happened. Rachel changed clothes, too. I planned to stay behind. Then Ethan appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked at me. He didn't say anything. Just one look. I understood. I grabbed my jacket. The club was about a 15-minute drive from the house, in a commercial area not far from downtown. A black sign hung above the glass entrance. Through the windows, I could see heavy bags, training mats, and a square fighting ring in the center of the main training area. I had been through plenty of gyms like it. They all smelled almost the same. Rubber, sweat, disinfectant, and that particular kind of atmosphere you find in a place where people come to see just how much their bodies can take. Derek walked in first. Almost immediately, someone called his name. One man slapped him on the shoulder. Another handed him a drink. 2 younger men shook Ethan's hand and congratulated him on graduating. Here, Derek was completely different from the man who had stood silently in front of the Mustang a few hours earlier. This was his territory. He laughed louder, talked more. Even his shoulders relaxed. On a wall near the ring hung several photographs of Derek competing as an amateur years earlier. In one, he stood with both hands raised after a win. In another, he wore gloves. One side of his face swollen, but he was still smiling. Derek noticed me looking. He didn't say anything. He just smiled. I knew that smile. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a man who had just remembered that he had something he wanted to prove. The party was set up in an area behind the ring. About 20 people were there, most of them Derek's relatives and friends. A few were people I had never met. Rachel quickly joined a group of women near the cake table. Ethan sat off to the side, an unopened bottle of water in front of him. I chose a chair beside him. For the first half hour or so, nothing happened. People talked about the graduation. summer plans, college. Someone mentioned the Mustang, but when they noticed Ethan didn't react, they changed the subject. Derek started drinking bourbon. The first glass went down quickly, the second more slowly. By the third, his voice had started getting louder. I wasn't counting because I cared how much he drank. I counted out of habit. One of Derek's friends asked what I did for a living. I answered briefly that I served in the military. The man nodded and was about to ask more when Derek cut in. He told my story for me, but his version was different from mine. In Derek's version, I was someone who had spent 16 years traveling all over the place, only to come home from time to time with a few medals and stories the whole family was expected to sit and listen to. A few people laughed, not maliciously. They thought he was joking. I let it go, Derek continued. He said the military was very good at making people believe that everything they did was more important than everyone else's ordinary life. This time, no one laughed right away. Rachel looked at him. I could see she wanted to stop him. But then she looked at Ethan and stayed silent. Derek took a sip of bourbon. He said a person could be taught how to march, shoot a gun, or survive in the desert, but none of that meant they knew how to raise a child. Ethan turned toward his father. I gently placed a hand on his arm, not to hold him back, just to tell him it wasn't necessary yet. Derek saw it, and that was when things got worse. He laughed, a short, cold laugh. Then he said that was exactly what he was talking about. I had been home only 2 days, and I was already acting as though Ethan needed me to protect him. A few people began staring down into their glasses. The room was still noisy, but the area around us gradually became quiet. I didn't answer. There's something a lot of people don't understand about silence. They think silence means you don't have an answer. In reality, sometimes silence simply means the other person hasn't given you a reason worth answering yet. Derek couldn't stand that. He stepped closer. He asked if I truly thought I understood Ethan better than his own father did. I stayed seated. I said only one word. No. Derek paused. Maybe he had expected me to argue. I continued, saying I hadn't raised Ethan and had never claimed to understand him better than his parents did. All I had done was listen when he spoke. Ethan lowered his eyes. Derek looked at his son. That statement bothered him more than any insult could have. He finished the rest of his bourbon. One of Derek's friends tried to change the subject to a fight the club had coming up that weekend. Derek wouldn't let him. He pointed toward the ring, then looked at me. He said that at least things were simpler in there than they were in families. 2 people stepped in. No speeches, no medals, no past for anyone to hide behind, just what a person could actually do. I began to understand where he was going with this. Ethan understood too. He stood up. Rachel immediately told her son to sit down. Derek laughed and told the people around us that Ethan had spent years idolizing Aunt Jessica, the military hero. The way he said the words military hero made several people uncomfortable. I still didn't stand. Derek turned to me. He asked whether Ethan had ever actually seen me fight. I didn't answer. Some questions don't need answers. He took another step closer. Now there was only a low table between us. I could smell the bourbon on his breath. Derek said maybe all Ethan knew were a few nice photographs and stories that had been repeated long enough to sound like legends. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He stood all the way up. That's enough, Dad. The room went silent. Derek looked at his son, not at me. This time, the anger on his face was no longer hidden. Sit down. Ethan didn't sit. I stood up. Not quickly, not suddenly. I simply stood between them. Derek looked at me and laughed. There, saving him again. I didn't answer. He picked up a freshly poured glass of bourbon from the table. For a moment, I thought he was only going to drink it. Then his wrist moved. The cold liquid splashed across my chest and shoulder. Some of it hit my neck. A few drops ran down my cheek. The entire room froze. I looked down at my soaked shirt. The smell of bourbon was strong. Rachel jumped to her feet. Ethan stepped forward. I raised one hand. He stopped. Derek was still holding the empty glass. He sneered. This time, no one mistook it for a joke. If you're so tough, fight me. No one said a word. Derek pointed toward the ring. Let the whole family see how good you really are. I looked at him. Maybe he thought I would get angry. Maybe he wanted me to yell, wanted me to shove him, wanted me to do anything reckless enough that he could turn to Ethan and say, "See? This is the person you want to become." I didn't give him that. I reached up and removed the small earrings I was wearing. I set them on the table. Rachel looked at me as if she had just realized what was about to happen. I gathered my hair behind my head, took the hair tie from my wrist, and tied it back neatly. No one said a word. I took off my light jacket and placed it beside the earrings. Then I walked toward the ring. I heard Ethan call my name. I didn't turn around. Derek laughed loudly. He thought my silence meant I had agreed to play by his rules. But Derek and I stepped into that ring for two completely different reasons. He stepped in to prove he was stronger. I stepped in to end this. One of the club's coaches tried to stop us. Derek said it would only be a light round, nothing serious. I looked at the man and said, I understood. I also asked him to stop it immediately if either one of us could no longer continue safely. Derek laughed again when he heard that. He put on training gloves. I said nothing else. An electronic clock hung on the wall behind the ring. I looked at it once. No one knew that later I would remember those numbers clearly. Derek moved first. He was faster than I expected, and strong. His 10 years of training weren't just for show. The first strike was a probe. I took half a step back. The next one was harder and passed close to my face. Someone outside the ring shouted something. I couldn't make out the words. When a situation begins, the sounds around me usually disappear. Not because I'm calmer than everyone else, simply because I had been trained for too many years to focus on what was directly in front of me. Derek pressed forward. I let him. For the first 10 seconds, he thought he was in control. 20 seconds later, he began to realize I wasn't reacting like the people he usually trained with. I wasn't trying to win every exchange. I was watching his footwork, his shoulders, his breathing, the way he shifted his weight every time he was about to rush forward. At around the half-minute mark, Derek lost his patience. That was his first real mistake. He came in harder. I moved to the side. Everything after that happened very quickly. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't dramatic like a movie. It was just a short sequence of movements, enough to turn his own strength into the thing that threw him off balance. Derek tried to recover his position. I didn't give him time. One knee hit the floor. He tried to get back up. I secured control of him before he could turn. Derek struggled hard. I held him. The coach stepped closer. 45 seconds. Derek was still trying to fight his way out. 48. I heard his breathing change. 49. I tightened the hold just enough for him to understand there was no way out. 50 seconds. Derek was sprawled on the floor. The room was completely silent. No cheering, no laughter. Only Derek's heavy breathing and the clock continuing to run on the wall. I released him, immediately, stepped back. I didn't raise my hands. Didn't celebrate. Didn't look at the people standing around the ring. Derek planted both hands on the floor and tried to sit up. His face was bright red, not from pain, from humiliation. I pulled up my sleeve to wipe away the bourbon still clinging to my neck. The movement exposed the scars running along my forearm beneath the lights. The same scars Rachel had seen years ago, the ones I had never explained. Derek looked at them. For the first time that night, he wasn't smiling. I looked down at him. My voice was quiet enough that I didn't need to shout, but everyone in the room heard me. You want to know what it's like to go up against a special reconnaissance soldier? I didn't wait for an answer. I stepped out of the ring. Ethan was standing right in front of me. His face didn't have the look of victory Derek had once imagined it would, only shock. I picked up my jacket from the table. I was just about to take my earrings when I heard quick footsteps coming from my left. I turned around. Rachel was standing in front of me. Her eyes were red. I didn't have time to say anything. Her hand swung toward me. A sharp slap cracked through the room. My head turned to the side. Everyone froze. My cheek burned. I slowly turned my face back. Rachel stood in front of me, her hands still trembling, and when I looked into my sister's eyes, I understood that her anger wasn't only about Derek losing. There was something much bigger behind that slap. Rachel's slap wasn't as hard as many things I had endured in my life, but it made me stand still longer than any strike Derek had thrown in the ring. Not because it hurt, but because when I turned back toward her, I saw my sister crying. Rachel wasn't sobbing. Tears simply streamed down both sides of her face, while the hand that had slapped me trembled so badly that she had to close it into a fist. Derek had gotten back to his feet behind her. Ethan stepped forward too. A few people in the club began avoiding eye contact. The relatives who had been watching the fight only moments earlier quietly backed away, as though everyone understood that this was no longer some foolish challenge between two adults. This was about a family. And some family matters only get worse when too many people are there to witness them. I looked at Rachel. I didn't ask why she had slapped me. I thought I already knew. She had just watched her husband get taken down in front of everyone. She had just watched me do something that, in her eyes, might have been the clearest proof of everything she had always feared about me. Violence, the military, the scars, the things she had spent 16 years trying to keep as far away from her son as possible. I bent down to pick up my earrings. Rachel suddenly spoke. She told me not to leave. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me stop. Ethan looked at his mother. Derek looked at her, too. Rachel wiped away her tears, then looked directly at me as though she had finally decided she couldn't keep something hidden any longer. I saw the fear in my sister's eyes before I heard the confession. Derek hadn't withdrawn the application. Rachel had. For a few seconds, I didn't understand what she had said. Not because it was complicated, but because my mind was still trying to find another explanation that made more sense. Rachel said it again. She was the one who had logged into Ethan's account. She was the one who had submitted the request to withdraw the application. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't accidental. She knew exactly what she was doing. Ethan didn't react right away. That's the part I remember most. He didn't yell. Didn't ask why. Didn't cry. He just stood there looking at his mother. There is a kind of pain that doesn't show up on someone's face right away. It begins with silence. Rachel stepped toward her son, but Ethan stepped back. Just one step. I saw her stop. Rachel began to explain. She had discovered Ethan's application about 2 months before I came home. At first, she thought it was only a passing idea. Ethan often read military books, watched documentaries, and asked me questions about the service. Rachel had hoped he would change his mind on his own. But then the invitation to move forward to the next stage arrived. She saw it on the family computer. Rachel knew the password because she had previously helped Ethan complete financial aid forms and college paperwork. That night, while Ethan was out with friends, she logged in. She read the email, then she saw the button to withdraw the application. Rachel said she sat in front of the screen for nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes, just staring at one button. I could picture her sitting in that quiet kitchen, one hand on the mouse, telling herself that what she was about to do wasn't betraying her son, it was protecting him. Eventually, she clicked it. 3 days after the invitation, exactly as the school representative had said, Ethan still said nothing. Rachel continued, faster now, as though if she stopped, she wouldn't have the strength to finish. Derek hadn't known at first. She had hidden it from her husband, too. But a few days later, Derek realized Ethan had stopped talking about the program. Rachel confessed. Derek got angry. Not because she had interfered with the application, but because she had done it on her own, without telling him. After that, he agreed to keep it quiet, because the final result was still what they both wanted. Ethan would stay in Colorado Springs. Ethan would work at the dealership. Ethan would not go down a military path. I turned toward Derek. He didn't deny it. Maybe by then he knew there was no point. But what bothered me most was the look on his face. There was no shame. Only irritation that a secret that should have stayed inside the family had been exposed in a room full of people. Derek looked at Rachel as though she had betrayed him. Ethan finally spoke. His voice was very quiet. He asked his mother why. Rachel opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Ethan asked again. This time, his voice was a little louder. I looked at Rachel. I had thought I would be furious. I had thought that once I learned the truth, I would tell her that no mother had the right to do what she had done, that Ethan was 18 years old, that his future wasn't an application she could simply close because she was afraid. I had already prepared all of those words in my head. But then Rachel looked down at my arm. My sleeve was still pulled up from the ring. The old scars ran from near my elbow down my forearm, lighter than the surrounding skin, with a few raised places visible beneath the lights. I didn't think much about them anymore. Rachel did. She pointed toward them, and I understood before she spoke. The day I came home after a mission many years earlier, Rachel had been one of the very few people who saw me before I had time to learn how to act as though everything was fine. She saw my arm, saw the stitches, saw me flinch at sudden loud noises, saw me sitting in the kitchen at 3 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. I had never explained any of it. I thought silence would protect my family from things they didn't need to know. Maybe I was wrong. Because when people don't know the truth, they often create a version in their minds that is even more frightening. Rachel looked at me and finally said what she had been carrying for years. I watched you come home as a different person. I don't want my son to end up like that one day. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning running overhead. I didn't know how to answer. Some accusations make you angry. Others make you realize that you never understood the fear of the person standing in front of you. Rachel didn't hate the military because of politics. She didn't hate it because of news stories or things other people had told her. She hated it because she had once watched her older sister come home and had no idea how to help her. I remembered that year. Rachel brought food over. I told her I wasn't hungry. She asked whether I wanted to talk. I told her there was nothing to talk about. She looked at the injuries. I pulled down my sleeve. She asked what had happened. I told her not to worry. I kept thinking I was doing the right thing. I didn't understand that. For Rachel, the words "don't worry" didn't make the fear disappear. They only made the fear nameless. I looked at Ethan, then back at my sister. For the first time since learning the application had been withdrawn, I no longer saw Rachel only as the person who had taken an opportunity away from her son. I saw a mother who was so afraid that she had done something she herself knew was wrong. That didn't make what she had done right, but it made it impossible for me to be angry in the way I had imagined. I told Rachel that I understood why she was afraid. She began crying harder. I also told her that fear did not give her the right to choose for Ethan. Rachel closed her eyes. Maybe she knew. Maybe she had known from the very night she clicked the button to withdraw the application. Ethan turned his face away. I saw his jaw tighten. That was when Derek stepped between us. And almost immediately, everything changed. Until that moment, Rachel's fear was something I could understand. Derek turned it into an order. He said things had gone too far. His voice wasn't loud at first, but it was firm. Derek said Rachel had nothing to apologize for because she had protected her son. He said an 18-year-old couldn't possibly know what was best for his own future. He said parents had a responsibility to stop their children from making decisions they would later regret. I looked at Ethan. He was no longer looking at his mother. He was looking at his father. Derek said he had spent 18 years building Ethan a future that thousands of other kids could only dream of. A successful business, a guaranteed job, a new car. One day, ownership of the dealership. According to Derek, that wasn't control. It was opportunity. I had met many people like him. People who believed that if what they offered was valuable enough, the person receiving it no longer had the right to say no. Ethan said he didn't want the dealership. Derek looked directly at his son. This time, there was no audience forcing him to pretend to be gentle. He listed every single thing he had given Ethan: a home, school, a car, money, the life he had. Then he delivered the final words like a sentence. As long as Ethan lived under his roof, Ethan would follow his rules. No Reserve Officers Training Corps program, no military, no more discussion. Monday morning, Ethan would report to the dealership. I looked at Rachel. She didn't object. But this time, I saw something different on my sister's face. Not complete agreement, hesitation. Maybe even she was beginning to realize that Derek had just crossed the line between protection and control. Ethan asked what would happen if he didn't go. Derek didn't answer right away. He stepped closer to his son. Only a few feet separated them. Then he spoke clearly enough for everyone around us to hear. If Ethan wanted to be treated like an adult, then he could live like one. Earn his own money, find his own place to live, pay his own tuition. No family car, not $1 from him. Rachel immediately called Derek's name. For the first time that night, she looked genuinely frightened. But he raised one hand to stop her. The decision had been made. I looked at Ethan. I waited for him to get angry, waited for him to yell, waited for him to say something he would regret later. He did none of those things. He simply gave a very slight nod. That nod worried me more than any shout could have, because I had seen that expression before. Not on a child being scolded by his father, but on people who had just decided that from that moment on, they would find their own way, no matter what it cost them. Derek turned toward me. Maybe he wanted me to say something, wanted me to interfere, wanted to prove to everyone that he had been right to believe I was the one behind Ethan. I didn't give him the chance. I simply pulled my sleeve down over the scars. Then I picked up my jacket. There was nothing left to settle in that room that night. Rachel had confessed the truth. Derek had made his rules clear, and Ethan had just learned that his parents' plans weren't merely advice. They were a cage. As we left the club, I walked a few steps behind Ethan. He didn't look back. I didn't call to him either. I thought he needed time. At that point, I still believed the hardest part was over. The withdrawn application, Rachel's confession, Derek's ultimatum. I didn't know Ethan had already gotten one step ahead of all of us. And what he was about to reveal would make both Derek and Rachel realize that during all the time they had been fighting over who would decide their son's future, Ethan had already begun taking it back for himself. No one spoke on the drive home. Derek drove in front. Rachel sat beside him. Ethan and I were in the other car. For nearly 15 minutes, he simply stared out the window. I didn't push him. It wasn't until we turned into the neighborhood that Ethan finally spoke. He told me not to worry about him. I looked over. It wasn't something a child says because he wants reassurance. Ethan's voice was so calm that I understood he had been preparing for this long before tonight. When we reached the house, Derek went straight inside. Rachel followed him. Ethan stood beside the Mustang, still parked in front of the garage, the ribbon on the hood now sagging after a full day outside. He looked at the car for a few seconds, then turned toward me. 2 weeks earlier, before I had even returned to Colorado Springs, Ethan already knew something was wrong with his application. He didn't know who had withdrawn it, but he knew he hadn't. At first, Ethan had also thought it might have been a system error. Then he had called the program office himself, sent emails, explained that he had never requested to withdraw, and asked whether there was any way his application could be reconsidered. He had done all of it alone, without telling Rachel, without telling Derek, and without telling me. The program representative had asked Ethan to verify his identity, resubmit several documents, and write a statement explaining the withdrawal. Because his previous record still met the requirements and the final deadline had not completely passed, they allowed him to complete the process again. No guarantee of a scholarship, no guarantee he would be selected. Just a chance to continue from the place where he never should have been forced to stop. I stood looking at my nephew beneath the garage light. For the first time in the past several days, I understood that I wasn't the one saving Ethan. He had never needed that. He only needed someone willing to believe that he had the right to make his own decision. Ethan looked toward the front door. Then he said the one thing that night that truly broke my heart. I don't need Mom and Dad to agree with everything I do. I just want them to stop living my life for me. I didn't answer right away, because there was no advice better than that truth. 3 months later, Ethan received his college acceptance letter. He didn't get everything exactly the way he had once imagined. The scholarship process had to be reviewed again, with more paperwork, more interviews, and more weeks of waiting. But in the end, Ethan still had a path forward. The day he left Colorado Springs, the Mustang was still sitting in Derek's garage. Ethan didn't take it. He didn't go to work at the dealership, either. That morning, Derek stood beside his pickup truck with both hands in his pockets. He no longer talked about the office he had prepared on the second floor. Didn't mention the nameplate. Didn't mention Ethan taking over the business one day. Maybe he still didn't agree, but for the first time, he understood that his disagreement was no longer enough to stop his son. Rachel had been crying since Ethan carried the first suitcase down the stairs. She checked his food, medicine, paperwork, and kept asking about things Ethan had already checked the night before. When it was finally time to leave, Ethan hugged his mother for a long time. Then he turned toward Derek. Father and son looked at each other for a few seconds. No one apologized. No one won. Finally, Ethan stepped forward and hugged his father. Derek froze for a moment before putting a hand on his son's back. I saw his hand tighten. Some people take a very long time to learn that holding on tightly to someone is not the same as making them want to stay. Ethan drove away in his old car. Not the Mustang. Not the car Derek had chosen to mark out his son's future. Just the same car Ethan had driven to school every day. Rachel stood in the street until he disappeared completely from view. I left Colorado Springs the next morning. Before I went, Rachel stood in the doorway and looked once more at the scars on my arm. She seemed like she wanted to say something. I knew it might have been an apology. I didn't ask for one. I didn't need one, either. There are some things an apology can't fix right away. But sometimes, understanding why someone did something wrong is the first step toward a family finally stopping the cycle of hurting one another. It took Derek exactly 50 seconds to lose to me in the ring, but that was never his real defeat. His real defeat came the day he stood in front of the garage and watched his son drive away. Unable to use money, a Mustang, a job, or his authority as a father to keep him there. And maybe it would take much longer for Derek to understand the same thing Rachel was also learning. After everything that happened, I understood that loving someone does not mean having the right to decide their life for them. Rachel was wrong to secretly withdraw Ethan's application, but behind that mistake was the fear of a mother who had once watched war leave scars on her own sister. Derek loved his son too, but he turned that love into control, using money, work, and his authority as a father to force Ethan onto the path he had chosen for him. And Ethan made me realize that growing up doesn't mean rebelling against your parents. It means having the courage to take responsibility for your own choices. I also learned that sometimes we need to listen before we judge. A family should not be a place where people are held together by fear or power. A family should be a place where each person is loved, respected, and allowed to become who they truly are. If you have ever found yourself in a situation like Ethan's, leave a comment and tell us what you would choose. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more meaningful family stories. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.